record now, if that's okay. Great. So yeah, well, I'm sure we'll have some others joining as we go along, and I'll keep an eye on the waiting room as we get started. But I want to welcome everybody who's watching live, and welcome everybody who's watching asynchronously to this new webinar series that we're kicking off as part of the Center for Research offer at ESF. And I'm extremely pleased to have Dr. Ian Buchanan joining us today to kick off this multiple part series focusing on concepts related to the idea of assemblages. So we've got some really, really exciting theoretical stuff coming our way at the kind of higher levels in the SF. It's been really interesting to see this move towards, thinking about complex systems, thinking about how different practices, different activities in specific schools, but across schools and across the foundation, thinking about how these things link together, trying to think in new and complex ways about how schools work, and seeing that happen at the kind of foundation level. We were talking and thinking, well, it's really important for us to, as practitioners, as leaders and teachers, to engage with this theory and to try and dig into it. And I'll be the first to say that thinking about assemblages and thinking about complexity is, by definition, not always easy. But I'm really pleased that we have Ian with us, because Ian's fantastic book that I have here in front of me, and his other work is a real testament to Ian's capacity to dig into these things and to explain them in a way that makes sense for people who are trying to apply these ideas in practice. So the idea is, for the next 55 minutes or so, we've got time for Ian to talk to us and engage with some of the theoretical questions that we're dealing with, and then we'll have some time for questions. And obviously, as usual, if you want to stick a question in the chat, then please do. And lastly, I'm just forwarding on apologies from Jacques, who would normally be here for these sessions as well, but he's on leave at the moment. So he's sending his apologies and would wish to be here as well. So, Ian, without further ado, I'll pass over to you. Again, thanks so much for taking your time to be with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to all those people who are presently listening or will be listening in the future. I'm sitting at a weird angle in order to kind of get rid of a weird light effect, but it does give you a sense of how many books I have accumulated over the years. Um, Far too many. Um, so I have a new book that's going to be the sequel to the one that Patrick just held up, which is wittily entitled Assemblage Theory and Affect, um, sort of extending the range of where we should apply the idea of the assemblage to. So the talk I'm going to give is not taken from that new book, but is kind of inspired by the things that I was writing in writing that new book. And I wanted to start with something that I thought would be practical for all of you, since many of you are teachers and you're in classrooms, and I thought it would be useful for you to have something you could work with. But also, I wanted to start with something that I think is quite accessible. So the talk I'm going to give relates to an essay called "What is a Creative Act," which you can find in English in this book, but it's also the recording of a lecture, and you can find that if you just Google Deleuze lectures. There is the Deleuze Lecture Project on Purdue University's website, and they have recordings and transcriptions of a great many of Deleuze's lectures, including this one. So it is freely accessible, and if your French is good, you can listen to Deleuze deliver it in person. So this lecture, "What is a Creative Act?" the Deleuze's lecture, not mine, is the title of a lecture that he gave in 1987 at La Fémis, which is a film school in Paris. Now, I did a little bit of digging, and something I didn't know until quite recently, but Deleuze's daughter, Emily, was a student there at the time. And if you know anything about Emily Deleuze, you'll know she went on to make a couple of very nice movies. So if you're interested in the sort of Deleuze legacy, you can check out those movies, including a film about the Melville novel Pierre or the Ambiguities. And so she made that, which you may remember Deleuze wrote about that novel. So there is quite a nice continuity that you can follow if you're suitably nerdy like me. So I wanted to start my series of lectures with this piece, and I hope you will all read it in due course. As I said, it can be found quite easily. Now, unlike some of Deleuze's work, or maybe most of it, it is quite accessible. So if you are new to his work, you may find it helpful to start with his lectures, this one and many of the others, that have been transcribed and now they're available in both English and French. Now, part of what makes it accessible is the fact that it's a very clear display of Deleuze's philosophical method, which consists in asking questions and demanding highly specific answers. And it's the specific answers part that's important. Deleuze always wants to know what is the unique, singular thing that art, that science, filmmaking, and so on, what is a singular thing that it does and that no other art or science can do? Now, in this regard, this piece is very nice as a short introduction to their work, and particularly it's a nice introduction to their book, What is Philosophy, which attempts to answer some of these questions. Now, sorry, I've got my own notes all mixed up already. Um, so in it also previews Deleuze's work, Societies of Control, which was another lecture that he gave towards the end of his life. And it may have been part of a rumored third volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Now, this is not just me starting the rumor. Guattari hints at it in his the series of lectures that he gave in Brazil, where he says that he and Deleuze were working on a book on contemporary image culture. Now, as far as I know, that book never came to anything, although one day we might find a lost manuscript in the archives. But what we do know is that around that time, Deleuze went on and wrote his books on cinema, and he said in interviews at that time that he felt he had to kind of do something on his own again, and I guess didn't want to collaborate on that particular project. So we don't really know. But for me, it's kind of an interesting speculation to think, well, what would have the third volume have looked like if it had been about image culture? And I guess the other way of thinking about it is, well, perhaps we could write it for ourselves. And certainly our era, far more so than Deleuze's, is absolutely dominated by image culture. And I think lastly, and most importantly, this essay takes us in two quite interesting directions that I think will be relevant to all of you as educators. So firstly, it offers an alternative to the Socratic method, which is premised on discovery and delineation, rather than refutation. So the Socratic method is premised on refutation. It's this or it's not this, and so on. Whereas Deleuze is trying to say, well, how do we discover the thing? And Deleuze uses this method in all of his lectures. And what's really interesting is that he frequently answers himself by saying, I don't know. What do painters do? I don't know. And so you have a lot of these moments in Deleuze's lectures where he just says, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And he asks all these kinds of crazy questions. I also think this lecture may prompt us to pose questions for ourselves, such as, does teaching have its own idea? Does education policy have its own idea? And so on. And as Deleuze would say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think that it could be productive for us to try to answer them in discussion time. So let me try and set up how we might go about that. So Deleuze says in his lecture, what happens when you say, hey, I have an idea? And he says, everyone knows that having an idea is rare, so it is worth celebrating. And the idea we have, he says, is never a general idea. It is always highly specific to the domain. Um, so, what does he mean by that? So, for example, he says an idea in cinema is very different from having an idea in art or even philosophy. And this means, he says, we cannot treat philosophy as though it is a discourse for thinking about, which is to say, having ideas about anything, because it too has its own highly specific domain, which is that of concepts. He says, no one needs philosophy to think. So, filmmakers and artists, they don't need philosophy to think. They don't even need it to generate ideas. Their ideas are always practical and related to the specific domain of what they are working with. So, their ideas are generated by working with the materials of their craft. So I really like this, and I think from an education point of view, it's kind of interesting. But at least one of the things it's saying is that philosophy is not a superior discourse that somehow um, does all the thinking for us, as though other fields don't do thinking of their own and don't have ideas of their own. So I think there's a kind of modesty to this, which is really, to me, quite encouraging. And I think it's something that pedagogically is quite useful because it puts all the different discourses on a similar kind of footing. We all have ideas. Our ideas are about materials. Our materials differ, so our ideas differ. The question is, can we find a sort of common platform whereby we can have a conversation about what ideas are in relation to their materials? And in that sense, philosophy can learn from filmmaking rather than the other way around. So he says, so let me give you an example. Think about the idea of montage in film. So the most basic definition of montage is that it is the sequence of images. And we could think of it like this: montage is the power of the sequence of images. Now, this isn't something you can think in isolation from a series of images. So one of the ways that Deleuze explains this is he talks about the difference between what he calls the sensory motor scheme and the sort of other, the time image and so forth. But if you think about a camera following a person, and the camera is sort of following the person from one room to the next room to the next room to the next room and the next room and so on. Now, if a character is moving from, their bedroom to the kitchen, do we need to see them walk through every single room of the house, past, the toilet, etc., etc.? But how much of that do we need to see between them getting from the bedroom to the kitchen? So really, montage is a form of selection, which basically says you don't need to see these images in order to know that this character went from this door and ended up in the kitchen. Okay. And so the great discovery of film was that you could, in fact, leave huge chunks out. Okay. So montage is really about the exclusion as much as it is about inclusion. What must you include, but what can you safely exclude for the story to be told? And so Deleuze describes that as essentially this is an idea. Once you have the idea of montage, you make film possible. Okay. Without it, it's kind of impossible because you're tied to a very specific sequence of events, as though the camera could do nothing but follow something. So when cinema was first invented, people would watch a train roll into the station and they would be quite excited by that because it hadn't been done before. But from a narrative point of view, that's quite limiting. And so the cut can mean that you can jump from the train rolling in to then suddenly you can see somebody's face on the train, etc., etc. So montage creates the possibility of film as a narrative device. So what Deleuze says is that we can't really think about montage in the absence of images. We can only think about it in terms of its material. And this is true, Deleuze suggests, even though he also claims that filmmakers were inspired by literature. So he, for example, argues that Dickens invented the close-up. One of his famous sequences where he talks about Dickens, and how the story starts by saying the cricket started it. You can sort of imagine the camera zooming in on the cricket. Now, the other thing that he says is that each of these ideas have to have their own necessity. One can't simply make up an idea like montage. The idea of montage has to have necessity. So, what does Deleuze mean by necessity? Now, in this lecture, he admits that it's a complex idea, but he doesn't really explain it. So, we kind of need to extrapolate and answer it from elsewhere in his work. So I think the best way to understand it is to see it as an answer to the question, what would be genuinely new in a given context? So we're trying to understand the idea of necessity in an artistic sense. So film, art, and so on. To put it another way, it refers to that which has neither been thought nor done before. So necessity then refers to something like the overcoming of the constraints of what had been done before. And in his book on Francis Bacon, but also in his lectures on painting, which I'll talk about more in a moment, um, Deleuze rejects the idea of the blank canvas or the blank page. So he says no artist has ever confronted such a thing. Because for them, the canvas, the page, is already overcrowded with all the work that has gone before, all the images that have already been made, all the sentences that have already been written, all the stories that have been told, all the films that have been made, and so on. And that these act like a powerful constraint on the imagination of the artist because they know that unless they can do something different, they're merely being derivative and repetitive. Okay. So, in other words, they're not terrified by the blank page. What they're terrified of is the overcrowded page. And so, what Deleuze is interested in is how do the artists get beyond that overcrowded page? How do they get to something new? How do they find their own necessity? So, necessity then means something like I have to do it this way because if I do not, it will be derivative, it will be repetitive. So, necessity is that feeling that the only way to be original is by doing things in this particular way. And Deleuze is a bit of a snob in this regard because he more or less says anyone who isn't concerned with this particular problematic isn't a real artist. If you're not concerned about trying to be original, then you're not really an artist. You're not doing anything. You're just being repetitive. So, what is the medium of filmmakers? What do they think with? Now, Deleuze says they think with blocks of movement and duration. Okay, so a film is always literally a moving image. In the old days, you think about it as the reel going around. It was literally a moving image. And because it's a moving image, it also has duration. Okay. So, any image that you watch of film is distinct from a photograph for the fact that it has duration. So that means that as an artist making film, what you are really always thinking about is how to fill the screen with both duration and movement. You can't avoid it. You can't make a movie that doesn't have either movement or duration. So the cinematic image is a moving, enduring, or durational image. So filmmakers think in terms of how much time should be spent looking at what moving image. And this is, in a sense, independent of any story that they want to tell. Okay. So, in other words, when we're thinking about film from the perspective of an idea, we shouldn't be thinking about it from the perspective of either a story to tell or representation or anything like that. Rather, how do we think about it purely in terms of moments in time? Because that's what a film is. A film is simply a collection of moments in time. So think of movies in which um, I should say I'm not going to show any images or any slides or anything like that, and it's partly because I don't believe in it, and I don't believe in it because most of the research that says that showing slides is a good thing was sponsored by Microsoft, who in turn sold teachers a whole bunch of software and said you can't be a teacher unless you do it. So I never show it. But I also was reading Deleuze's book on painting, and at the start of the lectures, he says, we will never show any paintings. If you want to look at the paintings, go look at them, but there will be no images. You have to use your imagination and your mind. So I kind of follow his lead. So think of movies in which we see a spaceship, a horse and cart, a boat, a car, whatever, and they're approaching us. They begin from very far away, so we can hardly make out what they are. They get closer, and closer, and closer. Now, the question this poses for the filmmaker is how much time should be given to this image? 1 second, 1 minute. And the important thing from our point of view is whatever meaning we attach to this image will largely depend on its duration. Okay. Not just what we are seeing, but for how long we are seeing it. If it is very short, we will probably view it in quite instrumental terms. It was merely necessary to show the arrival of a character. But if the scene is protracted, our mind starts to drift. Instead of thinking about arrival, we think about the journey itself. We may even subjectify our view and think of it in terms of how hard it must have been for the travelers themselves. And if it's really long, like several minutes, then we would conclude the film must be French. Um, so the limit that all creative acts must confront then is the limit of invention itself, the capacity to produce something new. Okay. And so what I'm trying to say about the film then is that what makes an image new may be its length, whether it's short or long. Some of you looking at faces and not making too many judgments probably remember that the moment when MTV first arrived, when we were all much younger and more full of hope. And we were all, I imagine, quite astonished at just how rapid the cuts were. Like you never got time to think about anything, to see anything, and so forth. So it was a transformation of our understanding of the duration of the image. And it seemed radically new to us. In other words, what I'm saying is what the content of the images was not new. We'd seen videos before, but the rapidity of the cuts was new. And the movement between images, the rapidity of that was new. And so that was for us an idea. And it was an idea at the level of duration. Okay. Now, Deleuze is very much a modernist in this regard because this is going back to my previous statement about the capacity to produce something new. Ezra Pound's slogan, make it new, resonates throughout Deleuze's work, though, as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I've read everything, he never specifically mentions Pound, no doubt because Pound was a fascist. But nonetheless, he clearly holds to that idea of let's make it new. So the limit of invention for any kind of invention is space-time itself, something that never emerges for itself or by itself, but is nonetheless present in every image. And so Deleuze is surprisingly Kantian when he says this. And one may also note this is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by the concept of the plane of organization. It is the specific relation of space and time that underpins any given moment of a film or a text. For those of you with a literary theory background, you may recall the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, who used the term chronotope for this. And his example was Ulysses, who goes away for 20 years, but never seems to age. So space-time works differently for him. It's a bit like watching the Lord of the Rings movies. They go on for 3,000 years, but allegedly only lasts for 3 hours. There's a time slip difference there that happens, but we have a new space time for those movies. Now, another obvious cinematic example of this dislocation of sound and image is the dislocation of sound and image. So, for example, we may hear the approaching car long before we see it. Okay. So instead of an image of a car approaching, we have the sound of a car approaching, but we do not see it. Or likewise, we might hear voices off screen, but we never actually see the faces of who is speaking. And so it creates for us a dislocation between sound and image. The extension of this is the soundtrack, okay? Noises, music, and so on that we hear that is not present in the scene itself. For those of you that did film studies, you'll remember Bordwell and Thompson describe this as the difference between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. So diegetic sound is what's happening on the screen, relates to the narrative. Non-diegetic sound is non-narrative related. It happens off screen. Um, but in a way, that seems a fairly boring way to think about it. What happens really, I think, is that the music changes, or rather begins to carry the affective weight embodied by the scene. Okay. So to give you an example, picture a scene, a man or a woman, dog, whatever, walking along a street in the suburbs in the middle of the day. Okay. Just really, fairly bland kind of scene. Then imagine it with different music. Walking on Sunshine, Blister in the Sun, Dire Straits' Walk of Life. These boots are made for walking. You can think of any number of songs, Walk This Way, etc., that involve walking in their chorus line. Depending on the song, it is a completely different affect for the scene. Like you radically change the feeling that one gets in relation to the scene according to the soundtrack, and the soundtrack is not present in the scene itself. Okay, so that is an idea, and obviously this idea now is absolutely common in film. Practically any film uses it. It's more or less impossible to think of a movie that doesn't use it in some way. So Deleuze's books on cinema are basically histories of ideas of this type, specifically cinematic forms of invention. So what he really talks about is not so much what does this film mean or that film mean? Was it good? Was it bad? But did it invent a new kind of an idea that was then adopted and became part of the kind of furniture, as it were, of filmmaking? Okay. So for him, he was interested in when was the moment when this particular idea was invented that we then see repeated throughout all kinds of cinema. And he was kind of also interested in when was the last time it got used? Was it possible to exhaust the idea? So think of things like close-ups, reaction shots, long shots, high shots, and so on. One of the things I used to do, many years ago, I used to teach film classes. And one of the things I used to get the students to do is to just, we'd imagine a scene, and I would say to them, okay, so now if the camera goes up and we're seeing this from above, what does that mean? Two people standing together, we see the cam, it's a high shot looking down, or it's a long shot seeing them far away, or it's really close, or we're looking at one face and the other face. You don't even have to know what they are saying. You know from the film angle already what that scene is trying to do. And so that's what Deleuze was interested in. He was interested in how the way that the image is set up itself has meaning, and that setup constitutes an idea. Someone had to have the idea, hey, why don't we do this? Okay. Um, I also want to add that Deleuze's interest in invention, in addition to being very modernist, is also what we might think of as utopian. So the American literary critic Frederick Jameson, some of you may have heard of him, who sadly died last year, always defined utopian thinking as that which imagines the unimaginable. And his famous phrase in this regard was that we seem to find it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So let me give you an example of what I mean by a radically new idea. And I got this from a meme that was circulated recently. My daughter and I are Star Wars fans, and we share the best Star Wars memes with each other. And she sent this one to me, which I think is really great. Um, so basically, they say, "So you mean to tell me that talking to um, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you mean to tell me that you hid the boy, Luke, from his father, but you kept his name, Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker, and you hid him with Anakin's brother, and you hid him on the same planet where Anakin comes from. And how does that sort of constitute hiding? And when you think about that, it's absolutely extraordinary. Like, how on earth did the scriptwriters never come up with that? And I was thinking about it, and I think the answer goes something like this. It suggests to me that while Lucas had no problem imagining space flight or imagining the Force or whatever, he couldn't imagine something like Google on a vast interplanetary database connection scale, obviously. But when he was making that film in the mid 1970s, the idea of something like Google that just simply collected and connected all databases such that anything like that would be instantaneously findable. I mean, if Darth Vader had Google, he would have found Luke like that, right? So, quite an extraordinary idea. And so it's that idea that was missing. Okay, that the idea of Google itself or of an interconnected database was missing from Star Wars. They couldn't even think of it. So, according to the science fiction theorist Darko Suvin, the presence of a new idea, or what he calls a novum, is the key defining characteristic of science fiction. Now, I think we get an even clearer understanding of what Deleuze meant by having an idea in his recently published lectures on painting, which I have the book here for you. So they've now published it as a book, but this whole text is available freely online. You can listen to the lectures, etc., etc. Now, Patrick, I have to ask a question. I'm a bit confused. Was I meant to talk for 30 minutes, then take questions, or talk for 50 minutes and then questions? Because I have been talking for 30 minutes already and I have a pile to go. And I'm a
Yeah,
bit
no,
worried I'm going to be.
no, feel free, Ian. Yeah, we've still got some time. So yeah, if you've got more to say, we're very happy to listen.
Okay. You can edit that out later. So these painting lectures were given around the same time as the film lecture in 1987, and they were recorded by his students and then later transcribed. It's quite a lovely story. Deleuze's students were so obsessed by his lectures that at least 10 in any one lecture brought a tape recorder with them and recorded them all. So, since you are all engaged in education, I think you would enjoy reading Deleuze's book on painting. I certainly have been enjoying it because it is very pedagogical in its approach. I think it is Deleuze at his most peachy. So, in the opening lecture, he says, painters spend most of their time failing to do whatever painterly thing they set themselves to do, but also mostly failing to produce something new. Okay. Now he doesn't say this in a sort of judgmental way. He says this, sorry, in a kind of highly empathetic way. Like most of us spend most of our time when we're trying to think of something new, failing to do so. And that doesn't mean we're failures. It just means, that sort of great Beckett quote, ever tried, ever failed, try again, fail better. That's the creative process, right? And again, this is a very modernist outlook. So for Deleuze, ideas cannot be evaluated as right or wrong, true or false, good or bad. They can only be judged as to whether they are new or not. And if they're not new, they're not ideas. So ideas are essentially problems that artists try to confront and that no one artist ever resolves for all time, such that there is nothing more to do. And this is why there are schools of artists. Um, Collectively, though, they can exhaust our interest in a particular problem, which is why there are new movements. And some artistic movements don't last very long at all. Think about the early days of Cubism, of Picasso and Braque and so forth. They kind of ran out of steam pretty fast because ultimately they're awful pictures to look at. Um, and that limit is measured in terms of repetition. When variation feels like repetition, that is a sign that a given artistic idea has reached the point of exhaustion. And Picasso's artistic career offers a kind of demonstration of this point. One can almost sense his fatigue with each new period, but also his joy as he left it behind and started something new. And all the way through his career, his paintings are animated by a sort of a particular representational problem, which has to do with the limit of figuration itself. So Deleuze says there are three moments in painting. Okay. Now, I think this is really teachable. I reckon you could teach this to 5-year-olds. First, there is the pre-pictorial moment when the artist confronts everything that has been done before and feels overwhelmed by the abundance of cliches that they have to figure out how to avoid. So the page is never blank. Okay. Second moment then is the necessity with coming up with what Deleuze calls a diagram. You can think of it as a plan that will enable the artist to escape cliche. And Deleuze also refers to this moment as the catastrophe, which he means in a very positive sense. It's a kind of strange word to use, but he means it in a positive sense because the catastrophe for him has the quality of an epiphany, whereby the artist sees both what prevents them from doing new things, cliches, and a way past the cliche. So for Deleuze, the artist looks at the not blank page, and for them, that's a kind of a catastrophe because it's a disaster. How do I start? Where do I begin? And so on. But then at the same time, the more they think about the cliches and they think about all the things that they can't do, the kind of nearer they get to the idea of what they can do. For Deleuze, the most pressing kind of cliche is that of representation itself, the idea or the demand that an image should look like a particular thing. He also thinks this is a false problem. However, the solution to this problem isn't to abandon figuration altogether and free fall into conceptual art, which Deleuze had no interest in, because that avoids rather than solves the problem. And Deleuze regarded conceptual art as too theoretical in a bad sense, meaning that it could not be understood for itself because it needs a theory to explain it and to animate it and to give it meaning. So when you go look at conceptual art, you kind of look at the label to say, oh, this is modern life. And then you look at a pile of junk and you think, okay, yeah, that's modern life. But the point is, you can't make any sense of that pile of junk without a theoretical apparatus to give it meaning. And so for Deleuze, that's too parasitic. He wants the work of art to stand up on its own and to have its own meaning. And so the artist has to confront that problem and solve it, not just simply sidestep it altogether. In his view, the painter who best solved this problem was Francis Bacon, who confronted the photograph as sort of, in a sense, the absolute limit of figuration. No painter can do better. And thought, well, how does one continue to do figurative painting in an era of photography? And he realized that it was through distortion, thus emphasizing affect rather than representation. Now, there is a kind of second danger, as Deleuze puts it, that painters must confront, and that is the what he calls narrative, by which he means not just the painting appears to tell a story, but also that a story is needed to give the painting sense. If we're asking of a painting, what is it? That's the representational question. That's the first danger. If we're asking what's going on, that's narrative, and that's the second danger. And then, in a sense, the painting has failed. And this is because we're not attending to the specifically pictorial elements. So at its most basic, this means we're not thinking about lines, colors, brushstrokes, thicknesses of paint, and so on, and all the interrelationships between the elements. And so the elements of a painter's ideas are basically lines and, as Deleuze says, something like splodges of paint. Okay. Now, I think as a kid, I would have understood art better if it had been taught this way. Instead of being taught and told to paint a thing or to express something, being told to think about the relationship between lines and splodges of color and to think about that as a dynamic relationship and what can you do with it, to me would have been a much better approach. And I think it's a really great pedagogic question. Even preschoolers could respond to that question. So the third moment of painting is the invention of the diagram, of the plan, the way out of the problem, the invention of the solution to the problem of how to avoid the twin dangers of representation and narrative. So the diagram is something like the Kantian schema in that it is always presupposed but never appears for itself. And this particular schema, though, is not a relation between time and space, but rather a relation between line and color. So, in order to actualize the diagram, the painter, the artist, requires an assemblage. See, I told you, but I didn't say we'd get there eventually. I should have said we would get there eventually. And now that moment has
We knew we
arrived.
would. We knew we would.
40 minutes in, you've been wondering what on earth is he talking about? When's he going to start talking about assemblages? I was always talking about assemblages. I just forgot to mention it. Okay, so what does the painting assemblage consist of? So the painting assemblage consists of two types of material in a state of reciprocal presupposition, i.e., neither thing can exist without the other, and both are capable of becoming the other. The two types of materials are contents and expressions, and neither pre-exists the assemblage. Now, this is what I'm trying to get you to think about is what those things consist of. And one of the things I want to say is that paint isn't automatically a content any more than an image is automatically an expression. An assemblage is needed to select these materials and render them meaningful. In other words, the art assemblage precedes the artwork. And the truth of this point lingers on the fact that we can still ask the question of any image that we see, is it art? And recently, this question has really come to the fore with the advent of AI generated images that has prompted us to ask the question, if Copilot or Gemini creates this image for me, is it still art? And to even ask the question, is it art, presupposes that one believes there to be an answer, or better, a formula that would definitively distinguish between art and non-art. And that formula would never be present for itself in the artwork. We would only ever see its effects. And that formula would be the assemblage. So our starting point with an assemblage is never the question, what materials is it composed of, which is a sort of a long-standing mistake in the field, but rather, what problem is it trying to solve using these materials? So the content of the painting assemblage is not simply the sheer existence of paints, canvases, and so on, but rather the idea that these elements may be combined in a way that produces something that has necessity. So the real content then is the lines and the colors and the relations between them, which obey a set of definable, describable rules. Meanwhile, the expressive dimension has to do with the way the lines and colors confront and overcome cliches. An expression is not meaning per se, but rather the appearance of a combination of lines and colors that has attained necessity. We sense when we see it that things must be this way. And so we're back to the idea of the creative act. If artists don't or shouldn't strive to paint things in a representational way or tell stories, then what should they paint? And Deleuze's answer is that they should paint or try to capture forces. And forces are invisible. So the painter must find a way to render them visible. And Deleuze takes this idea from the German artist Paul Klee, who said the artist's task wasn't to capture the visible, but rather to render visible the invisible. And so let me give you a simple example, which is taken from Cézanne. Imagine a peasant carrying a sack of potatoes. Imagine the weight of those potatoes. How would one render that weight visible? Now, one might see it in the curve of the peasant's spine, the bend of their knee, the depth of their footfall, and so on. But what you are painting is not an image of a thing, but forces. You're trying to capture forces. And Deleuze says rendering visible the invisible takes place via what he calls the deformation of the form. Now, you can experiment with this yourself. Think of the classic bathroom selfie. Take a bunch of photos of yourself in different poses, and the key is to switch between tensed and untensed body positions, natural and unnatural body positions. The more contorted, the better. Then compare the images. And what you will see is that the more tense and complex the pose, the more deformed the form of the body seems, and the more visible the forces upon it become. And this is, of course, Bacon's effort. And so, in other words, this is how you capture forces by deforming the form. And this is also an example of an idea in painting. Deform the form in order to render visible the forces that are usually invisible. So let me go back a moment. Deleuze says painting consists of two processes, lines and splodges. And basically, this is the difference between drawing, then painting, or just painting, as Van Gogh famously did. So another way to deform is to dispense with the line and just splodge the paint on, but do so in a way such that we can nevertheless see the lines that aren't actually there. And this is something you could get your kindergarten kids to do. Do a painting without lines in such a way that I can see the lines. Likewise, it's possible to use just lines, even just black lines, in such a way as to make us see color. And this too is a deformation of the form. So deformation can be understood then in another way, and Deleuze describes it as a form of rebellion between the hand and the eye, whereby the hand refuses to draw and paint what it sees and instead creates according to its own form of perception. So the thing that I want you to see is that these are ideas, such as a deformation of form, that constitute the real elements of the painting assemblage. So another set of components that Deleuze talks about is the notion of the window and the frame. Is the image framed or not? Does it seem to go on forever? Is it tightly constrained? And T.J. Clark, in his book on Picasso, makes the observation that almost all of Picasso's works consist of interiors. Indeed, even when there's a window, you don't really get an external view. Contrast that with someone like Matisse, who never seemed to tire of painting the view from his windows in Nice. Meanwhile, Cézanne and Monet could not be contained by rooms. They simply painted the vast panoramas. So my key message here is that ideas, diagrams, assemblages are expressed in things, but do not themselves has a visible form. So if you point at something and say, that's an assemblage, then you are wrong. Rather, you should point at something and ask, what is the nature of the assemblage that makes it work? And here we're kind of in the territory that Bourdieu describes in terms of the difference between knowing the rules of the game and knowing how to play the game. It's a train going past. The assemblage is more about knowing how to play, but just as Bourdieu's examples emphasize, it is also a form of knowing that depends upon the rules. You can't make art without rules, but you also can't make art without knowing how to play with the rules. And so if you're thinking about that dynamic relationship, then you are in the realm of the assemblage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian. That's brilliant. And exactly what we're hoping to do in these sessions, which is to be able to talk about education without necessarily be talking about education. And yeah, there's so much in there that I'm thinking about now about how the sort of artistry, how we can think about education as a kind of art form or as a kind of practice of artistry and dig into it that way. So we've got about 7 minutes left. Any thoughts or comments from the floor? Anyone who wants to ask anything or ask for any points of clarification or anything like that? Any thoughts that were percolating while Ian was talking then?
I'm going
Josh?
to admit that much of this went over my head. It could be that it's because it's 5 o'clock and it's been a very full day and I've been in meetings. But it was the statement of everyone knows having an idea is rare, so it's worth celebrating. And I know that was early on and not really, I don't think very much connected to the concept of assemblages. However, I think this is a really pertinent point because that power in I think if you'd ask people, they'd say, "Oh, yeah, I have ideas all the time." But the importance of perhaps what is behind that idea or where that sits within that scope. I also did appreciate your references to early childhood. Thank you. The idea of showing was it not drawing the lines, but showing the image or showing color through drawing lines in black, but not showing the actual color. I'm going to have to get out to a kindergarten and try some of this on my own because I'm really curious about that and what that would look like. Because I think there's this authenticity that exists with our young learners that hasn't been formed or drilled in perhaps yet. And a freedom of expression that exists there. So I'm continually amazed by my own son, who's almost 8, and kind of how his drawings convey things that I'm like, how did he come up with that? But it is this assemblage of parts that he's taken, and it's often just shapes and lines. But then the expression of the stick figure that's there is incredible. So that really resonated with me. Thank you.
Yeah, but those stick figures are a kind of um, in a way, it's because they've been told they have to do a line first before they can add color. And so, what I found really exciting about the Deleuze book, and I'd never really thought about it before, is what if you just disentangle that and you say to the kids, you can just use color, no lines, just color, but use your color in such a way that we can see the lines. And for me, that was quite an exciting sort of liberation. And I think it would change how kids approach pictures. They wouldn't feel so slavish. They could, I've got to draw a stick figure to try to get something representational going, but they could immediately launch into something quite different and perhaps more expressive. So I found that really interesting. And I've been working on Van Gogh quite a lot. And what I really loved about everything that I read about Van Gogh um, is that he didn't draw first. He started out doing drawings, but later on he just kind of put the easel there and the canvas there, and he just splodged the paint on and just created the image with no lines, and the lines were created by the swirls of color on the thing, but there was no drawing first, and was quite a liberation for him. And for him then what was interesting was the relationship between the colors and things. And so Deleuze talks about Van Gogh as having color as an idea. And it was so revolutionary in his time, he couldn't sell a single painting. People hated his paintings. It's hard to imagine now, like his paintings are amongst the most valuable and looked at in the world, but in his own lifetime, people hated them.
And I mean, yeah, there's something really interesting. I mean, to your point, Josh, about the way that younger learners will approach a task with maybe with less of that clutter on the blank page. That they're approaching it with a bit more of a kind of free spirit to put it in a kind of cheesy way, but literally, that they don't have the experience that's kind of cluttering what the expectation might be of that page. And that to me is just before we started this call, Josh and I were briefly talking about, how practitioners and how how students in different phases might approach the kind of question of what education is in different ways because of the varying weights on them. So that was taking me back to this question of how do we translate this into talking explicitly about education. And we had a talk with with Gerbiester a few days ago, who was making the case for teaching as an inventive act, not as a kind of prescriptive act. That if we see teaching as a prescriptive act, then it is effectively a kind of technical task rather than a creative or a cultural task. And so he was saying, well, if teaching is inventive, how does that help us to think differently about what teaching is? And so, sort of following that line, I was thinking, if we think about teaching as an art, and if we think about every lesson or as every day, of every day as that blank page, um, so moments in time, then how does that help us to think differently about the kind of challenge of teaching? Does that lead us to a kind of um, three-step approach to teaching, which is kind of similar to what, to the kind of three steps for teaching? Oh.
Mm.
And I'm not sure quite where I'm going with that, but it's, on one hand, I suppose I was thinking, literally every lesson is original if you're a teacher, because it doesn't matter how prescriptive you try to be, something weird will happen, right? There is something new in every lesson. So there is a kind of originality to your practice, whether you like it or not. But of course, at the same time, there is a real risk that, especially now, you use some kind of, Gen AI generated lesson plan and you deliver something that's highly repetitive. And of course, that changes across phases as well. But yeah, I'm not sure if any of that resonates, Ian, and everyone else.
Well, I think very quickly to answer, I think that if you were to ask what is an idea in teaching, um, if you approach it in the same way that a long shot is an idea that then multiple people can replicate and do creative things with. And if you think about teaching, what are the ideas in teaching? Well, the idea that you should put things on a blackboard or the idea that you should put things in a PowerPoint, this comes from an idea, which is that students need to see something in order to learn something, or they need to repeat something in order to learn something. So those are the ideas, and those are the sort of bedrock of education. And if you were going to write an account of the ideas of teaching, that's what you would be looking at. What are the things that people say, well, students must do this. And for me, one of the things that I found really interesting with the advent of PowerPoint and so forth is a kind of collapsing of the distinction between education and entertainment. And the idea that you had to be entertaining in order to teach, and that teaching couldn't be boring. And I find that really fascinating because, my own memory of things that are boring is that very often they were the things that taught me the most. And so as an idea, if all teaching has to be entertaining, then what do we do with the stuff that's boring? And does that mean that can't be taught anymore? And what are we doing with our minds if we're not forcing ourselves to confront boredom? I really love that essay by Heidegger, who says, sitting in a train station, he's bored out of his brain, and he suddenly realizes that he only has himself for company. So
Mm.
therefore, it's up to him to make his brain do interesting things. And he sort of regards that as the sort of source of creativity. And so I've always thought that if we deny students boredom, we also deny them creativity. If we
Mm.
constantly entertain, then they never kind of step into that mental space where they have to be the source of their own creativity. So to me, that's an idea. Like that would be an idea that's something that teaching could sink its teeth into and say, what's going on here.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and makes me think as well about sort of the time of teaching there's a kind of, on one hand, a kind of, thinking about time as capital, the importance of a return on investment, and therefore every moment must be as full as possible, but maybe also as entertaining as possible in order to
Mm.
maintain attention. And we see so much focus in the sort of so-called science of learning on, attention, memory, all of those things that, if you gamify your learning, as they say, somehow you're going to get more out of it. So there's and I know we're just over time, so if people do have to go, I appreciate, please feel free to jump off. But I just did want to raise this question from Ross, if that's okay, Ian,
Yes, of
because
course.
because I think it's a really important one for this series. So Ross has said, first of all, the clearest explanation of Deleuze's thinking he's heard, which is a nice compliment to round off things. But the question is the classroom or the lesson an assemblage or a collection of them? So, what I think that's a really good question to ask at this stage in the game. Um, like you said, if you're pointing and saying that's an assemblage, you might be wrong, but you can say what is the well, over to you. What would you say?
Yeah, I think from memory this was the topic for the next lecture anyway, so it
Hmm.
is something that I will be coming back to. The short answer is yes, the classroom would be an assemblage, but there is never only one assemblage, right? So one of the things that we have to try to think about is the interrelationship between multiple assemblages. And so when you think about the classroom, and this is conversation that I've had with Greg Thompson, um, the classroom is an interaction between a particular teacher and a bunch of students. But that interaction itself is one subset of a larger assemblage, which has to do with education policy, the education system, people's expectations of what's happening at school, what they want their kids to do. And so the interesting question is how do all those things kind of get linked together? And I think really that was kind of Foucault's question, you know. And so a lot of what Foucault was trying to do can also be re kind of interpreted through a lens of assemblage theory as well. Because essentially what Deleuze was interested in was, well, when and how did the state become so invested in the sort of micro relationship between the student and the teacher? You know, like when you think about it, it's actually quite an extraordinary state of affairs. Um, education 200-300 years ago, state didn't give a damn what the teachers were doing. The teachers just, parents cared. They sent their kids to particular schools in the hope they would learn something or whatever, but the state took no interest at all. And so for the state to begin to take an interest in that particular kind of relationship is a clear indication that there are multiple assemblages at work. And so the question then is, well, what had to change for the state to become interested? How did the classroom change once it did become interested?
And yeah, which is a probably a good place for us to round off on. But yeah, I really like that idea that looking at a single lesson or a single classroom is never only looking at that single lesson or single classroom, but looking into its connections to all these other things, and then fundamentally asking the question why. Yeah,
Yes.
why these things are connected. Well, I know it's getting late where you are, Ian, and it's getting later in Hong Kong and pushing towards the morning over here in Europe. So I just want to finish off by saying, Ian, thanks again so much for kicking this series off. I think we're going to learn so much, and there's so many exciting parallels to be drawn from the conversations that we're having. So thanks again for this
Thank you.
session. Thanks everybody for attending. There's always a choice to make between doing this and doing something else. So we really appreciate you being involved. And if everyone talks to one other person about it, then we are achieving our aim. And thanks to everyone who's watching asynchronously as well. Feel free to talk about this with somebody else that you work with, and the conversation will continue. Thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate it, Ian, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye for now.